Hello, and welcome to Sleepless History. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a journey through one of the most remarkable periods in Chinese history. Over the next few hours, we'll explore the Han Dynasty, a golden age that lasted over 400 years and shaped the very identity of China as we know it today. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we travel back more than 2,000 years to ancient China. Whether you're here to learn or simply to let the gentle rhythm of history lull you into peaceful rest, you're in the right place. The Han Dynasty began in 206 before the Common Era and lasted until 220 of the Common Era. That's over 4 centuries of continuous rule, making it one of the longest dynasties in Chinese history. But to understand how the Han came to power, we need to briefly visit what came before. Before the Han, there was the Qin dynasty. The Qin was China's first imperial dynasty, and it was founded by Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to truly unify China. He ruled from 221 to 210 before the Common Era. The Qin dynasty was revolutionary but harsh. Qin Shi Huang standardized weights, measures, and writing systems. He connected and extended the Great Wall. But his rule was also marked by brutal punishments, book burnings, and the burying of scholars alive. The Qin dynasty built incredible things, but it did so through forced labor and severe laws. When Qin Shi Huang died in 210 before the Common Era, his empire began to crumble almost immediately. His son was weak, and the empire descended into chaos. Rebellions broke out across the land as people who had suffered under Qin rule finally saw their chance for freedom. Among the rebels were 2 men who would determine China's fate. One was Xiang, a nobleman and brilliant general. The other was Liu Bang, a commoner of peasant origin who had worked as a minor official. These 2 men would fight for supremacy, and their conflict would give birth to the Han Dynasty. Liu Bang was born in 256 before the Common Era in Pei, in what is now Jiangsu province. He came from humble beginnings. Some records suggest his father was a farmer. Liu Bang himself worked as a pavilion head, a low-ranking position responsible for maintaining order in a small district. He was known for being generous and forming friendships easily, though he was also described as crude and fond of wine and women. When the Qin dynasty began to collapse, Liu Bang joined the rebellion. He wasn't the most talented general or the most educated leader, but he had a crucial skill. He knew how to win people's loyalty. He attracted talented advisors and generals who recognized something in him that others missed. Xiang, on the other hand, came from a prominent family of generals. He was a formidable warrior, known for his strength and military prowess. He was charismatic and bold. Many expected him to become the next emperor of China. The 2 men initially fought together against the Qin, but once the Qin fell, they turned on each other. The conflict between Liu Bang and Xiang is known as the Chu-Han Contention, and it lasted from 206 to 202 before the Common Era. For 4 years, these 2 men and their armies battled across China. Xiang won many of the battles. He was the better general in conventional warfare. But Liu Bang had patience, strategy, and most importantly, the support of talented advisors like Zhang Liang and Chen Ping, and the brilliant general Han Xin. One of the most famous stories from this period involves a feast. In 206 before the Common Era, Xiang held a banquet at a place called Hongmen. Liu Bang attended, and during the feast, several of Xiang Yu's advisors urged him to kill Liu Bang while he had the chance. A sword dance was performed, during which one of Xiang Yu's men tried to get close enough to assassinate Liu Bang. But Liu Bang's loyal follower, Fan Kuai, intervened and Liu Bang managed to escape. This event became known as the Hongmen Banquet, and it demonstrated both the danger Liu Bang faced and his ability to survive through wit and loyalty from his followers. Gradually, Liu Bang's forces gained the advantage. He was a master of logistics and knew how to conserve his resources while exhausting Xiang Yu's. He also made strategic alliances with regional powers who saw him as more reasonable and trustworthy than the volatile Xiang Yu. The final confrontation came in 202 before the Common Era at the Battle of Gaisha. Liu Bang's forces, led by Han Xin, surrounded Xiang Yu's army. According to legend, Liu Bang ordered his troops to sing folk songs from Xiang Yu's homeland of Chu. When Xiang Yu's soldiers heard these songs in the night, they believed their homeland had already been conquered, and many deserted. Xiang Yu, seeing his defeat was inevitable, committed suicide. Before dying, he is said to have lamented to his favourite concubine, expressing regret not for his military decisions, but that heaven itself had turned against him, not that he lacked in courage or skill. With Xiang Yu dead, Liu Bang became the undisputed ruler of China. In 202 before the Common Era, he proclaimed himself emperor and took the title Emperor Gaozu of Han. He chose Chang'an as his capital, near modern-day Xi'an. The Han Dynasty had begun. Emperor Gaozu faced enormous challenges. China had been devastated by years of war, first against the Qin and then the civil war between himself and Xiang Yu. The population had declined, farms had been abandoned, and the economy was in ruins. Gaozu needed to consolidate power while also allowing the country to recover. He adopted a policy of light government, in direct contrast to the harsh legalism of the Qin dynasty. He reduced taxes and minimized government interference in people's lives. This approach was influenced by Taoist principles of Wu Wei, or non-action, which suggested that the best government governs least. The idea was to give people space to recover and rebuild their lives without excessive demands from the state. However, Gaozu also faced a political challenge. He had defeated Xiang Yu with the help of various kings and generals who controlled different regions. These men had their own armies and territories. Gaozu couldn't simply dismiss them without risking another civil war. So initially, he created a hybrid system where he ruled directly over some central territories while allowing these regional kings to maintain semi-autonomous control over their lands. This arrangement was unstable. Over time, Gaozu began to systematically reduce the power of these kings. He replaced many non-family members with his own relatives, creating a system where members of the Lü family ruled various kingdoms under the overall authority of the emperor. This didn't completely solve the problem, as we'll see later, but it did give the central government more control. Emperor Gaozu died in 195 before the Common Era after ruling for just 7 years. He was succeeded by his son, who became Emperor Hui. But there's an important figure we need to discuss here, Empress Lü, also known as Empress Dowager Lü. Lü had been Liu Bang's wife since before his rise to power. She was intelligent, politically astute, and ruthless. When her son became Emperor Hui, He was young and gentle, not particularly interested in the brutal realities of political power, so Empress Dowager Lü became the real power behind the throne. Her reign was marked by palace intrigue and violence. She had eliminated rivals to her son's succession, including one of Emperor Gaozu's favourite concubines, Lady Qi, and Lady Qi's son. The stories of how she dealt with Lady Qi are particularly gruesome and won't be detailed here, but they established her reputation as someone not to be crossed. Emperor Hui died in 188 before the Common Era, possibly from illness, but possibly from the stress of watching his mother's brutal political maneuvers. After his death, Empress Dowager Lü installed a child emperor and continued to rule. She promoted members of her own Lü family to positions of power, threatening the Lü family's hold on the dynasty. This situation lasted until Empress Dowager Lü died in 180 before the Common Era. Immediately, supporters of the Lü family moved against the Lü family members who had been given positions of power. They were systematically eliminated, and the Lü family's control was restored. The man who emerged as emperor after this purge was Liu Bang, who became Emperor Wen. He was a son of Emperor Gaozu and had been ruling a small kingdom. He was chosen partly because he was seen as moderate and capable, but also because he didn't have a powerful maternal family that might threaten the balance of power. Emperor Wen ruled from 180 to 157 before the Common Era, and his reign is remembered as one of the best in Han history. Along with his son, who would become Emperor Jing, he presided over a period known as the rule of Wen and Jing, which lasted from 180 to 141 before the Common Era. This was an era of good government, economic prosperity, and recovery from the chaos of the early Han period. Emperor Wen continued the policy of light taxation and minimal government interference. He was known for his frugality. Stories tell of how he wore simple clothes and how, when he wanted to build a terrace, he calculated the cost and decided it was equivalent to the property of 10 middle-class families, so he abandoned the project. Whether these stories are entirely accurate or partly legendary, they reflect the image of a modest, responsible ruler. During this period, agriculture recovered. The population grew, trade expanded. The government accumulated surpluses in its granaries. The Confucian scholars of later eras looked back on this time as a golden age, an example of how benevolent government could bring prosperity and peace. However, there was still an ongoing problem with the kingdoms. Even though these were now ruled by Liu family members, they still had their own armies and significant autonomy. Emperor Wen tried to manage this through careful diplomacy and by gradually reducing their territories when opportunities arose. But the fundamental issue remained unresolved. Emperor Wen's son, Liu Qi, became Emperor Jing and ruled from 157 to 141 before the Common Era. He continued his father's policies initially, but he also took a firmer stance on the kingdoms. He and his advisor Cao Kuo devised a plan to reduce the kingdom's territories more aggressively, taking back lands on various pretexts. This led to the rebellion of the 7 states in 154 before the Common Era. 7 kingdoms, led by Lu Wu of Wu and Lu Ang of Chu, both members of the Lu family, rose in rebellion against the emperor. They claimed they were rebelling not against the emperor himself, but against the evil advisor Cao Kuo, who they said was manipulating the emperor. Emperor Jing, hoping to appease the rebels, had Cao Kuo executed, but the rebels didn't stop. They continued their uprising because, of course, their real grievance was losing their power, not the presence of one advisor. Emperor Jing then appointed Zhou Yafu, a talented general, to suppress the rebellion. Zhou Yafu employed excellent strategy. Rather than attacking the rebels directly, he cut off their supply lines and waited. The rebel kingdoms hadn't coordinated well, and as their supplies ran out and their forces weakened, Zhou Yafu's disciplined army defeated them one by one. The rebellion was crushed within 3 months. The failure of this rebellion had profound consequences. It demonstrated that the kingdoms couldn't successfully challenge the central government. After this, Emperor Jing and his successors further reduced the kingdom's power. Their territories were divided among more and more royal descendants, making each individual kingdom smaller and weaker. The kings were also stripped of administrative authority, essentially becoming figureheads who received income from their territories but had no real power. Emperor Jing died in 141 before the Common Era and was succeeded by his son Liu Che, who would become Emperor Wu. And here we reach one of the most important figures in all of Chinese history. Emperor Wu ruled from 141 to 87 before the Common Era, a reign of 54 years. This makes him one of the longest reigning emperors in Chinese history. His reign transformed the Han Dynasty and China itself. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent, established Confucianism as the state ideology, created a centralized bureaucracy based on merit, and launched ambitious projects that would have lasting impacts. When Emperor Wu took the throne, he was only 15 years old, but he was intelligent, energetic, and ambitious. Unlike his father and grandfather, who had emphasized rest and recovery, Emperor Wu wanted action. He wanted to expand China's territory, eliminate threats, and make the Han Dynasty great in a way that would echo through the ages. One of his first major actions was to change the ideological foundation of the state. Until this point, the Han Dynasty had been influenced by various schools of thought, including legalism from the Qin dynasty, Taoism with its emphasis on minimal government, and various other philosophies. But in 136 before the Common Era, Emperor Wu, on the advice of the Confucian scholar Dong Zhuo, established Confucianism as the official state ideology. This was a turning point. Confucianism emphasized moral leadership, respect for hierarchy, education, and ritual propriety. It held that society should be organized like a family, with the emperor as the father of the nation, officials as elder brothers, and the people as children to be guided and cared for. Confucianism valued education and believed that government officials should be scholars who had studied the classical texts. Dong Zhuo was the key figure in this transformation. He wrote memorials to Emperor Wu, arguing that Confucianism should be elevated above all other schools of thought. He proposed that the government should establish schools to teach Confucian texts, and that officials should be selected based on their understanding of these texts. This was revolutionary because it meant that, in theory at least, any man who studied hard enough could rise to high office, regardless of his birth. Dong Zhuo also developed a cosmological theory that connected the emperor with heaven. He argued that the emperor was the intermediary between heaven and earth, that his actions affected the natural world, and that natural disasters were heaven's way of warning an emperor who had strayed from the right path. This theory gave tremendous moral weight to the emperor's behavior, while also providing a framework for criticizing emperors who governed poorly. The establishment of Confucianism as state ideology didn't happen overnight. Other schools of thought continued to have influence, and many practices from legalism remained embedded in the actual functioning of government. Laws were still harsh by Confucian standards. The government still used strict controls and punishments, but the rhetoric, the ideals, and the education system were increasingly Confucian. This synthesis, sometimes called Han Confucianism or Imperial Confucianism, combined Confucian ethics and education with the practical requirements of running a large empire. It emphasized loyalty to the emperor, filial piety within families, respect for hierarchy, and the importance of ritual and propriety, while still maintaining the strong central control and efficient bureaucracy that the empire needed. Emperor Wu established an imperial university in 124 before the Common Era to train officials in Confucian classics. This was the beginning of the examination system that would later become so central to Chinese government. Initially, the university had only 50 students, but it would grow to house thousands in later years. Students studied the 5 classics, the Book of Changes, the Book of Documents, the Book of Poetry, the Book of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. This emphasis on Confucian education created a new type of elite, the scholar, official. These were men who gained their positions not primarily through birth or military prowess, although those still mattered, but through education and merit. This system wasn't perfectly meritocratic. Wealthy families still had advantages because they could afford to educate their sons, but it was more open than purely aristocratic systems. Emperor Wu also reformed the government structure. He created new offices and departments, including the imperial counselor system with 3 senior ministers, the chancellor, the imperial counselor, and the grand commandant. Below them were 9 ministers who handled specific areas like finance, rituals, justice, and the imperial household. This bureaucratic structure became the model for Chinese government for centuries to come. But perhaps Emperor Wu is most famous for his military campaigns. The Han Dynasty faced a major threat from the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic peoples to the north. The Xiongnu were skilled horsemen and archers, capable of launching rapid raids deep into Chinese territory. Previous Han emperors had dealt with this threat through a policy called Hechin, or marriage alliance, where Chinese princesses were sent to marry Xiongnu leaders, along with gifts of silk and other goods. This essentially amounted to paying tribute to keep the peace. Emperor Wu decided this was unacceptable. He wanted to defeat the Xiongnu militarily, but he needed allies and intelligence. This led to one of the great adventures of ancient history, the journey of Zhang Qian. In 138 before the Common Era, Emperor Wu sent Zhang Qian on a mission to contact the Yuezhi, a people who had been driven west by the Xiongnu and who Emperor Wu hoped might become allies against their common enemy. Zhang Qian set out with about 100 men. Almost immediately, he was captured by the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu kept Zhang Qian prisoner for 10 years. They gave him a wife and tried to make him forget his mission, but Zhang Qian never did. After a decade, he managed to escape and continued his journey westward. He travelled through what is now Central Asia, reaching as far as Bactria in modern-day Afghanistan. He found the Yuezhi, but they had settled in fertile lands and had no interest in fighting the Xiongnu anymore. Jiang Qian's mission had failed in its primary objective, but his journey had enormous consequences. On his return trip, he was captured by the Xiongnu again and held for another year before escaping once more. When he finally returned to China in 126 before the Common Era, 13 years after he had left, he brought back detailed information about the lands, peoples, and trade routes of Central Asia. His reports opened Chinese eyes to a vast world beyond their borders. He told of great horses in Fergana that sweated blood, of powerful kingdoms in Parthia and Bactria, of goods and technologies unknown in China. His journey laid the groundwork for what would become the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that connected China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Armed with Jiang Qian's intelligence, Emperor Wu launched military campaigns against the Xiongnu. He appointed talented generals like Wei Qing and Huo Kubing. Wei Qing was actually the emperor's brother-in-law, married to Emperor Wu's sister, and Huo Kubing was Wei Qing's nephew. These campaigns, which began in 133 before the Common Era, were massive undertakings. Armies of tens of thousands of cavalry swept across the northern steppes, engaging the Xiongnu in their own territory. Huo Kubing was particularly successful, conducting daring raids deep into Xiongnu territory. In 121 before the Common Era, he led a force far to the northwest and reached the Tian Shan Mountains, dealing severe blows to Xiongnu power. The campaigns were successful in military terms. The Xiongnu were pushed back, their power fragmented, and some groups even submitted to Han authority. But these wars were also incredibly expensive. They required massive resources, vast numbers of horses, and constant supplies of food, weapons, and equipment. The costs would eventually strain even the wealthy Han treasury. Emperor Wu also expanded in other directions. He sent armies south, bringing what is now southern China, including parts of modern Vietnam, under Han control. He established commanderies in Korea after defeating the kingdom of Women Josei in 108 before the Common Era. The Han Empire reached its greatest territorial extent under his rule, stretching from Korea in the east to Central Asia in the west, and from Mongolia in the north to Vietnam in the south. To pay for these military campaigns and his other ambitious projects, Emperor Wu needed revenue. He implemented various economic policies, some innovative and some controversial. He established state monopolies on salt and iron in 117 before the Common Era. These were essential commodities that everyone needed, so controlling their production and sale brought enormous profits to the state. The salt and iron monopolies were deeply unpopular with many people, especially merchants who had previously profited from these trades, and Confucian scholars who felt the government shouldn't be involved in commerce. In 81, before the Common Era, after Emperor Wu's death, a famous debate was held on whether these monopolies should continue. The debate was recorded in a text called Discourses on Salt and Iron, and it gives us fascinating insights into Han Dynasty economic thought. The government representatives argued that the monopolies were necessary to fund military campaigns that protected the people from barbarian invasions. The Confucian critics argued that the government should reduce military spending, that the monopolies hurt common people by raising prices and reducing quality, and that the government's proper role was moral leadership, not commerce. Ultimately, the monopolies continued, though with some modifications. Emperor Wu also attempted to stabilize prices through a system called the ever-normal granary. The government would buy grain when prices were low and sell it when prices were high, supposedly to prevent both famine and profiteering. In practice, the effectiveness of this system varied, but the idea influenced economic policy for centuries. Another way Emperor Wu raised revenue was through manipulation of the currency. He issued new coins and sometimes reduced the precious metal content, effectively creating inflation. He also sold official titles and positions, allowing wealthy men to buy nobility or government posts. This brought in money, but had the side effect of corrupting the bureaucracy. Despite all these measures, the constant military campaigns drained the treasury. In his later years, Emperor Wu launched an expensive and ultimately unsuccessful campaign to obtain the heavenly horses of Fergana. These horses were prized for their strength and endurance, supposedly sweating blood. In 104 before the Common Era, after an initial failed expedition, Emperor Wu sent a massive army of 60,000 men on a second campaign. They besieged the capital of Fergana and forced the kingdom to surrender the horses. But the costs in money and lives were enormous, and when the horses finally arrived in China, many had died on the journey. As he aged, Emperor Wu seems to have had regrets about some of his policies. In 89 before the Common Era, he issued what's known as the Repenting Edict, in which he acknowledged that his military campaigns and heavy taxation had brought suffering to the people. He announced a shift toward more lenient policies, reducing taxes and scaling back military operations. In 87 before the Common Era, Emperor Wu died at the age of 69 after ruling for 54 years. He had transformed the Han Dynasty into a true empire, established Confucianism as the state ideology, created a merit-based bureaucracy, and expanded Chinese territory to its greatest extent. But he had also exhausted the treasury, imposed heavy burdens on the people, and left his successors with challenges that would take decades to resolve. Emperor Wu was succeeded by his youngest son, who became Emperor Zhao. Emperor Zhao was only 8 years old when he took the throne, so a regency was established. The key figure in this regency was Wang, the half-brother of the famous general Huo Kubing. Wang was a capable and loyal official who genuinely seemed to prioritize the welfare of the dynasty. During Emperor Zhao's reign, from 87 to 74 before the Common Era, the government focused on recovery. Taxes were reduced, military campaigns were scaled back, and the emphasis was on allowing the people to rest and the economy to recover from Emperor Wu's ambitious but costly policies. This was a wise approach, and the Han Dynasty stabilized. Emperor Zhao died in 74 before the Common Era at the young age of 20. He had no heir. Wang and the other regents selected Liu He, a grandson of Emperor Wu, to be the next emperor. But Liu, he proved to be unsuitable. According to historical records, he engaged in scandalous behavior, ignoring propriety and indulging in excess. After only 27 days on the throne, Wang and the officials deposed him. This was an extraordinary action, showing the power that the regency and the bureaucracy had accumulated. The officials then selected Liu Xun, who became Emperor Xuan. Emperor Xuan was a great-grandson of Emperor Wu, but he had grown up in poverty. As a baby, he had been imprisoned due to political purges against his family. He was eventually released and grew up among commoners, experiencing life in a way no other emperor had. This gave him a unique perspective. Emperor Xuan ruled from 74 to 48 before the Common Era. For the first years of his reign, Huoguang continued to hold real power, and Emperor Xuan wisely chose not to challenge him. Huoguang died in 68 before the Common Era, and after his death, Emperor Xuan moved carefully to reduce the Huo family's influence and consolidate his own power. He did this without causing a major crisis, showing considerable political skill. Emperor Xuan's reign is considered one of the best in Han history. He combined firm control with moderate policies. He reformed the legal system, making it more lenient and consistent. He reduced corruption in the bureaucracy. He maintained the peace with the Xiongnu through a combination of diplomacy and defensive military measures. The economy continued to recover and grow. Population increased, agriculture flourished, and trade expanded. There's a famous story about Emperor Xuan that illustrates his governing philosophy. His crown prince's tutors wanted to educate the prince in a purely Confucian manner, emphasizing benevolence and virtue above all else. Emperor Xuan reportedly said, "The Han family has its own institutions, which are based on a mixture of the way of the hegemon and the way of the king. How can we use pure Confucian methods?" This showed his pragmatic approach. He valued Confucian ideals, but believed they needed to be balanced with practical, sometimes harsh measures when necessary. Emperor Xuan died in 49 before the Common Era, and his son Lu Shi became Emperor Yuan. And here we begin to see the start of a slow decline that would eventually lead to the fall of the Western Han Dynasty. Emperor Yuan ruled from 49 to 33 before the Common Era. He was well educated in Confucian classics and personally kind, but he was not a strong ruler. He allowed power to concentrate in the hands of his relatives and court favorites. In particular, members of his wife's family, the Wang family, gained increasing influence. One member of the Wang family who rose to prominence during this period was Wang Mang. We'll hear much more about him later, as he would eventually overthrow the Han Dynasty entirely. But during Emperor Yuan's reign, the Wang family was just beginning its accumulation of power. Emperor Yuan's reign saw factional disputes at court. Confucian scholars argued about the interpretation of the classics. Eunuchs, who served in the inner palace, began to gain political influence. Court officials formed alliances and competed for power. The emperor himself often seemed unable or unwilling to decisively resolve these conflicts. The economy remained generally prosperous, and there were no major external threats during this period, so the decline was not immediately obvious. But the foundations were being laid for future problems. Concentration of land in the hands of wealthy families, corruption in the bureaucracy, and the growing power of imperial relatives and eunuchs. Emperor Yuan died in 33 before the Common Era and was succeeded by his son, who became Emperor Cheng. Emperor Cheng ruled from 33 to 7 before the Common Era. His reign continued and accelerated the problems of his father's time. Emperor Cheng was more interested in pleasure than governance. He delegated authority to various relatives and favorites while he indulged in entertainment. The Wang family, particularly Wang Mang's uncle, continued to accumulate power. The emperor's mother, Empress Dowager Wang, used her position to promote her family members. There were some capable officials who tried to reform the government and curb the power of the Wang family, but they were consistently outmaneuvered or removed from office. Emperor Cheng had no surviving sons. Some historical sources suggest that infant princes may have been killed by members of the imperial harem who feared they might threaten the position of their own relatives. Emperor Cheng died in 7 before the Common Era, possibly from overindulgence in aphrodisiacs and alcohol, though the exact cause isn't certain. Since he had no sons, he was succeeded by his nephew, who became Emperor A. Emperor I ruled from 7 to 1 before the Common Era, just 6 years. He attempted to reduce the power of the Wang family and promote his own mother's family, the Fu and Ding families. This led to intense factional conflict. He also attempted some reforms, including trying to limit the amount of land and number of slaves that wealthy families could own, hoping to address the growing inequality in society. But Emperor I faced opposition from powerful interests who benefited from the status quo. His reforms were not implemented effectively. He also had a famous favourite, a young man named Dong Zhuo, whom he promoted to high office and showered with wealth and honours. This caused scandal and weakened his authority. Emperor I died suddenly in 1 before the Common Era at the age of 25. Like Emperor Cheng, he left no heir. The Wang family, which Emperor Ai had tried to suppress, immediately moved to retake power. Wang Mang, who was now the most prominent member of the family, arranged for a child, Liu Can, to become emperor. This was Emperor Ping, who was only 9 years old. Emperor Ping ruled from 1 before the Common Era to 6 of the Common Era, but of course he didn't truly rule. Wang Mang was the regent and held all real power. Wang Mang used this time to build his own base of support. He was careful to present himself as a model Confucian gentleman, humble, devoted to the classics, and dedicated to serving the dynasty. He gave away much of his wealth to scholars and the poor, creating a reputation for benevolence. He proposed and implemented reforms that were popular with certain groups. He gathered support from Confucian scholars by positioning himself as someone who would restore the ancient ways described in the classics. He arranged for his daughter to marry Emperor Ping, further cementing his position. In 6 of the Common Era, Emperor Ping died. He was only 14 years old. Historical sources suggest Wang Mang may have poisoned him, though this isn't certain. What is certain is that Wang Mang then chose an infant, Luoyang, to be the nominal emperor. The child was only 2 years old. Wang Mang declared himself regent again. For 3 years, Wang Mang ruled as regent of the infant emperor, but in 9 of the Common Era, he took the final step. He declared that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the Han Dynasty and granted it to him. He forced the infant emperor to abdicate and proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Xin dynasty, which means new. The way Wang Mang orchestrated his usurpation was methodical and, in its own way, brilliant in terms of political theatre. He didn't simply seize power through military force. Instead, he built a narrative of heaven's will and popular support. He arranged for numerous portents and omens to be reported. Ancient texts appeared that supposedly prophesied his rise to power. Unusual animals were sighted. Celestial phenomena were interpreted as signs from heaven. Officials and scholars submitted memorials urging him to accept the mandate of heaven. All of this was carefully orchestrated to create the impression that his ascension to the throne was not a personal ambition, but a cosmic necessity. Wang Mang also carefully cultivated his image as a Confucian sage and a humble servant of heaven. When first offered the throne, he refused, claiming unworthiness. Only after repeated entreaties from officials and, supposedly, clear signs from heaven did he reluctantly accept. This false modesty was a calculated performance, but it was effective in winning support from some quarters. On the day of the abdication ceremony, the infant Luoyang was brought forward. Officials read proclamations declaring that the Han Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven and that Wang Mang was now the rightful ruler. The child emperor, too young to understand what was happening, was made to hand over the imperial seal to Wang Mang. Wang Mang accepted it and proclaimed himself emperor of the Qin dynasty. He treated the deposed emperor well, at least initially, giving him a noble title and estates. This was partly genuine. Wang Mang does seem to have had some scruples, and partly political calculation, showing magnanimity to quiet critics. The Han imperial family and their supporters were shocked and angry, but in that moment they were powerless to resist. The usurpation of the throne by Wang Mang marks the end of what historians call the Western Han Dynasty. The Han would be restored later, but there would be an interruption. We'll talk about Wang Mang's rule and the restoration of the Han, but first, let's reflect on what we've covered so far. We've journeyed from the founding of the Han Dynasty by Emperor Gaozu in 202 before the Common Era, through the consolidation of power under Emperors Wen and Jing, the great expansion and transformation under Emperor Wu, the recovery and stability under Emperor Xuan, and the gradual decline under Emperors Yuan, Cheng, Ai, and Ping. That's over 200 years of history, filled with brilliant leaders and weak ones, great achievements and costly mistakes, expansion and recovery, innovation and tradition. The Western Han Dynasty had created many of the institutions that would define Chinese civilization. A centralized bureaucracy based on Confucian principles, an examination system for selecting officials, state monopolies on key resources, an expansive empire connected by trade routes, and a complex court culture with all its intrigues and factional politics. Now, let's turn to Wang Mang and his Qin dynasty. Wang Mang ruled from 9 to 23 of the Common Era, just 14 years, but his reign was eventful and ultimately catastrophic. Wang Mang came to power, claiming he would restore the golden age described in ancient texts. He was deeply influenced by Confucian classics and by the idea that the ancient sage kings had ruled through perfect virtue and benevolent institutions. He believed that by recreating those ancient institutions, he could bring about a similar golden age. He implemented a series of radical reforms. In 9 of the Common Era, he nationalized all land. Private ownership of land was abolished, and all land became the property of the state. The idea was to redistribute land equally among farmers, ending the concentration of land in the hands of wealthy families. In theory, this would eliminate poverty and create a society of independent, prosperous farmers. He also abolished slavery, or rather, he abolished the buying and selling of slaves, declaring that human beings should not be treated as property. Again, this was based on his reading of ancient texts which he interpreted as opposing slavery. These reforms sound progressive, even noble, but they were also completely impractical and faced massive resistance. The land nationalization plan was impossible to implement. There was no effective mechanism for redistributing land. Wealthy families resisted losing their property. Local officials, many of whom came from wealthy landowning families, had no interest in enforcing the policy. The reform caused massive confusion and disruption without actually redistributing much land. Similarly, the abolition of slavery faced fierce opposition from slave owners. The wealthy had always used slave labor, and they saw no reason to give up this source of workers. Faced with these practical difficulties and the opposition of the powerful, Wang Mang backed down. Within 3 years, in 12 of the Common Era, he rescinded these reforms. Land could be privately owned again, and slavery was legal once more. This reversal made him look weak and damaged his credibility. Wang Mang also attempted to reform the currency multiple times. He introduced new coins, changed denominations, and tried various schemes to stabilize the economy. But each currency reform caused confusion and economic disruption. Merchants and common people alike suffered as the value of money kept changing. Some of his new coins were so complex, with different sizes and values, that they were difficult to use in ordinary transactions. He reorganized the government, changing titles and structures to match those described in ancient texts. He changed the names of offices, altered protocols, and tried to recreate institutions that had existed, or that he believed had existed, in ancient times. These changes didn't improve governance, but did create bureaucratic confusion. Wang Mang's reign also faced natural disasters and external threats. Around this time, the Yellow River changed its course, a catastrophic event that happened periodically in Chinese history. The river flooded vast areas, destroying farms and villages, killing countless people, and creating refugees. This disaster was interpreted by many as a sign that heaven had not actually granted Wang Mang the mandate to rule. To make matters worse, Wang Mang mishandled relations with the Xiongnu. He reduced their tribute and insulted their leaders by changing their titles. This led to renewed conflict on the northern frontier, creating additional military expenses and dangers. By the late teens of the Common Era, Wang Mang's regime was failing. The economy was in chaos due to his repeated reforms and reversals. Natural disasters had created widespread suffering. Military campaigns against the Xiongnu were draining resources, and most fundamentally, he had lost the confidence of key groups. The wealthy families who had initially supported him felt betrayed by his reforms. Confucian scholars were disappointed that his classical idealism hadn't worked, and common people blamed him for their suffering. Rebellions began to break out across the empire. 2 major rebel movements emerged. One was called the Red Eyebrows, because the rebels painted their eyebrows red to identify each other. These were mostly peasants and displaced people who had been hit hardest by the disasters and economic chaos. The other movement was led by members of the Liu family, descendants of the Han emperors who wanted to restore the dynasty. The Red Eyebrows were primarily a movement of survival. They looted granaries and wealthy estates to feed themselves. They had little organization beyond local leaders and no clear political program beyond opposing Wang Mang. The Han Restoration movement was more organized. It included several different groups led by various members of the Lü family. They fought not just against Wang Mang, but also sometimes against each other as different Lü claimants competed for supremacy. One of these Lü descendants was Liu Xu, a man who would become Emperor Guangwu and restore the Han Dynasty. Liu Xu was a 9th generation descendant of Emperor Jing of Han. He came from a relatively minor branch of the family and had been living as a scholar and farmer in Nanyang. In 22 of the Common Era, Liu Xu and his older brother Luoyang joined the rebellion against Wang Mang. They gathered followers and achieved several military victories. Luoyang became a prominent rebel leader and was offered the imperial title by his followers, but he modestly declined. However, another rebel group, led by a different member of the Lü family named Lu Xuan, was also gaining power. Tensions arose between these different Lü factions. In 23 of the Common Era, Liu Xuan's supporters, fearing the growing power of the brothers, had Luoyang killed. This left Liu Shou in a dangerous position. He was grieving for his brother, but also had to be careful not to appear as a threat to Liu Xuan. Liu Xu showed remarkable political skill. He hid his grief and anger, paid respects to Liu Xuan, and accepted a minor military command. He bided his time, building his own base of support, while officially serving under Liu Xuan, who had proclaimed himself emperor of the restored Han Dynasty. Meanwhile, in the capital Chang'an, Wang Mang's regime collapsed. In 23 of the Common Era, rebel forces, a combination of Liu Xuan's troops and the Red Eyebrows, reached the capital. The city fell and Wang Mang was killed. According to accounts, his body was torn apart by the mob and his head was kept as a trophy. The Xin dynasty had lasted just 14 years. It had been an ambitious experiment in reforming society according to classical ideals, but it had failed catastrophically. Wang Mang's story is a complex one. He wasn't simply a villain or a usurper. He appears to have genuinely believed in his reforms and his mission to restore ancient virtues. But his idealism was combined with political ambition. His reforms were impractical and poorly implemented, and his handling of the practical challenges of governing was inadequate. Liu Xuan, who had proclaimed himself emperor, now nominally ruled the Han Dynasty from Chang'an, but his hold on power was weak. He was not a particularly capable leader. The Red Eyebrows, who had helped defeat Wang Mang, were not under his control and continued to pillage. Different military leaders controlled different regions. The empire was fragmented. Liu Xu, meanwhile, had been sent by Liu Xuan to pacify the regions north of the Yellow River. This turned out to be a crucial mistake by Liu Xuan because it gave Liu Xu an opportunity to build his own power base away from the capital. Liu Xu proved to be an excellent general and administrator. He won the loyalty of talented officers and officials. He defeated warlords and bandits, bringing order to the territories under his control. In 25 of the Common Era, 2 years after Wang Mang's death, Liu Xu's followers urged him to declare himself emperor. He did so, proclaiming himself Emperor Guangwu and establishing his capital at Luoyang, east of Chang'an. This marked the beginning of what historians call the Eastern Han Dynasty, named for its more eastern capital. Now there were 2 rival Han emperors, Liu Xuan in Chang'an and Liu Xuan in Luoyang, but Liu Xuan's position continued to deteriorate. The Red Eyebrows entered Chang'an in 25 of the Common Era and overthrew him, installing a puppet emperor. Liu Xuan was later captured and killed. The Red Eyebrows then found themselves in control of Chang'an, but unable to govern effectively. They were an army, not an administration. Emperor Guangwu, from his base in Luoyang, gradually expanded his control. He was patient and strategic. He didn't rush to confront all his enemies at once. Instead, he made alliances where possible, defeated enemies piecemeal, and built up his strength. In 27 of the Common Era, the Red Eyebrows, struggling with food shortages and internal conflicts, decided to leave Chang'an and head east. Emperor Guangwu's forces met them and defeated them. The Red Eyebrows' puppet emperor surrendered, and their movement collapsed. But Emperor Guangwu's work was far from done. China was still fragmented. Various warlords and regional strongmen controlled different areas. Over the next decade, from 27 to 37 of the Common Era, Emperor Guangwu conducted a series of campaigns to reunify the empire. He was successful largely because of his combination of military skill and political wisdom. He knew when to fight and when to negotiate. He won the loyalty of capable generals like Deng Yu and Wu Han. He also treated defeated enemies with relative leniency, offering them positions in his administration if they surrendered, which encouraged others to submit rather than fight to the death. By 36 of the Common Era, Emperor Guangwu had reunified most of China proper. The only significant holdout was Gongsun Shu, who controlled the rich region of Sichuan and had proclaimed himself emperor there. In 36 of the Common Era, Emperor Guangwu launched a major campaign against Gongsun Shu. The campaign was difficult. Sichuan was naturally defensible, but Emperor Guangwu's superior resources and generalship eventually prevailed. Gongsun Shu was killed in battle in 36 of the Common Era, and Sichuan submitted. With this, Emperor Guangwu had restored the Han Dynasty and reunified China. It had taken him 14 years from his initial declaration as emperor. The achievement was remarkable, especially considering he had started as a relatively minor figure, had lost his brother, and had to navigate treacherous political and military terrain. Emperor Guangwu then turned to the task of governing. He faced enormous challenges. China had been through decades of chaos. The decline of the late Western Han, Wang Mang's failed reforms, the rebellions, the civil war, and the reunification campaigns. The population had declined dramatically. Farmland had been abandoned. The economy was disrupted. The government bureaucracy had broken down in many areas. Emperor Guangwu adopted policies focused on recovery and consolidation. Like Emperor Gaozu, the founder of the Han Dynasty, he emphasized light taxation and reduced government demands on the people. He wanted to give the population space to recover. He understood that the key to recovery was agriculture. Most people in ancient China were farmers, and agricultural production was the foundation of the economy and the tax base. Emperor Guangwu issued edicts encouraging farmers to return to their lands and cultivate abandoned fields. He reduced the land tax to 1/30th of the harvest, a very low rate that allowed farmers to keep most of what they produced. He conducted land surveys to establish a clear record of who owned what land and to assess taxes fairly. This was a massive undertaking. Teams of surveyors travelled across the empire, measuring fields and recording ownership. Some powerful families resisted, claiming they didn't have as much land as they actually did, trying to evade taxes. Emperor Guangwu personally reviewed cases of discrepancies and punished officials who took bribes to falsify records. He worked to eliminate corruption in the bureaucracy, personally reviewing judicial cases and promoting honest officials. He encouraged his officials to speak frankly about problems in government, creating an atmosphere where criticism was tolerated and even welcomed, at least from those who offered it respectfully and constructively. He reduced the size of the army now that the wars were over, both to save money and to return soldiers to productive farming. At the height of the reunification wars, he had commanded hundreds of thousands of troops. Now he reduced this to a much smaller standing army, relying on local militias and temporary levies if military needs arose. He also dealt with the problem of the large landowners. During the chaos, powerful families had acquired vast estates, often through dubious means, and many peasants had become tenant farmers or even slaves. Emperor Guangwu couldn't completely solve this problem without triggering the kind of resistance that had doomed Wang Mang's reforms. But he did issue edicts against illegal slavery and tried to provide some relief to tenant farmers. One of his edicts prohibited the sale of human beings and freed many who had been illegally enslaved. While this didn't eliminate slavery entirely, it did reduce it and establish the principle that slavery should be limited. He also tried to prevent powerful families from using violence or legal trickery to seize land from weaker neighbours. Emperor Guangwu was personally frugal and hard-working. Stories tell of how he would rise early and work late, personally reading reports and memorials from officials across the empire. He wore simple clothes and ate plain food. He set an example of diligent administration. He was also relatively lenient with his former enemies. Many of the generals and officials who had opposed him were given positions in his government if they surrendered and proved their loyalty. This pragmatic approach helped to bring stability more quickly than a vengeful policy would have. He understood that the empire needed healing, not more conflict. He avoided unnecessary purges and tried to reconcile different factions. His court included men who had served under Wang Mang, former rebels, and loyalists who had supported him from the beginning. What mattered to him was competence and loyalty going forward, not what someone had done in the chaos of the civil war. On the foreign front, Emperor Guangwu faced the usual problem of the northern nomads. The Xiongnu had split into two groups during this period of Chinese civil war, the southern Xiongnu and the northern Xiongnu. Emperor Guangwu made an alliance with the southern Xiongnu, giving them land and subsidies in exchange for their help in defending against the northern Xiongnu. This was a pragmatic policy that would be continued by his successors. He also had to deal with various kingdoms and tribes on the frontiers. Some had broken away during the chaos and needed to be brought back under Han authority. Emperor Guangwu conducted some military campaigns, but generally preferred diplomacy and demonstrations of strength to prolonged warfare. Emperor Guangwu died in 57 of the Common Era after ruling for 32 years. His reign is considered one of the most successful in Chinese history. He had restored a fallen dynasty, reunified a fragmented empire, and laid the foundation for another period of prosperity and stability. Later emperors and scholars would look back on him as a model of effective leadership. He was succeeded by his son, Luoyang, who became Emperor Ming. Emperor Ming ruled from 57 to 75 of the Common Era. He continued his father's policies and was also considered a capable ruler. Emperor Ming maintained the emphasis on good administration, frugality, and Confucian values. he was known for his personal attention to detail in governance. He also continued his father's policy toward the Xiongnu, maintaining the alliance with the southern Xiongnu while defending against the northern Xiongnu. One significant event during Emperor Ming's reign was the first official contact between China and Buddhism. In 64 of the Common Era, according to traditional accounts, Emperor Ming had a dream of a golden figure flying in front of his palace. His advisors told him this was the Buddha, a sage from the West. The emperor sent envoys to India to learn about this teaching. The envoys returned with Buddhist texts and 2 monks, Kasyapa, Matanga, and Dharmaratna. Emperor Ming had the White Horse Temple built in Luoyang to house them, reportedly named after the white horse that had carried the Buddhist scriptures to China. This is considered the first Buddhist temple in China. Buddhism would take several more centuries to really take root in Chinese culture, but this marked the beginning. Initially, Buddhism was understood by Chinese people through Taoist concepts, as they tried to fit this foreign teaching into familiar frameworks. Over time, Buddhism would be transformed by Chinese culture and would transform Chinese culture in turn, becoming one of the major religions in China. Emperor Ming also launched military campaigns in Central Asia. The general Ban Chao led expeditions that reasserted Han control over the city-states of the Tarim Basin, the region that the Silk Road passed through. This was important for maintaining trade and for preventing the northern Xiongnu from dominating the region. Ban Chao's campaigns, which continued into the next reign, were successful. He spent over 30 years in Central Asia, using a combination of military force, diplomacy, and strategic alliances to bring the various kingdoms under Han authority. At one point, he even sent an envoy, Gan Ying, to try to reach the Roman Empire, which Chinese called Dachin. Gan Ying got as far as the Persian Gulf, but turned back without reaching Rome, though he brought back reports of this distant empire. Emperor Ming died in 75 of the Common Era and was succeeded by his son, who became Emperor Xiang. Emperor Xiang ruled from 75 to 88 of the Common Era. His reign is also considered a good one, the last of what historians call the prosperous early Eastern Han period. Emperor Zhang continued the policies of his father and grandfather. He was known for being kind and lenient in his judgments, sometimes overruling harsh punishments recommended by his officials. He emphasized education and Confucian learning. He personally participated in Confucian rituals and encouraged scholarship. During his reign, the White Tiger Hall discussions were held in 79 of the Common Era. This was a great conference of Confucian scholars who debated the interpretation of the classics. Emperor Zhang presided over these discussions, and they were recorded for posterity. This showed the emperor's commitment to Confucian learning and the importance of scholarship in Han governance. Emperor Zhang also continued to support Ban Chao's campaigns in Central Asia. By the end of his reign, the Silk Road was secure and trade flourished. Goods flowed between China, Central Asia, India, and the distant Roman Empire. Silk, the most famous Chinese export, was highly prized in the West. In return, China received horses, precious stones, glassware, and other exotic goods. Emperor Zhang died in 88 of the Common Era. With his death, the golden age of the Eastern Han began to wane. The emperors who followed were mostly children when they took the throne, and power increasingly fell into the hands of regents, particularly empress dowagers, and eunuchs. Emperor Zhang's son became Emperor He and ruled from 88 to 105 of the Common Era. He was only 10 years old when he became emperor, so his mother, Empress Dowager Du, served as regent. She was from the Du family, which now joined the list of consort families that had gained power through the emperor's mother. Empress Dowager Du promoted her brothers to high positions, and they became very powerful. But Emperor He, as he grew older, became resentful of their control. In 92 of the Common Era, when he was 14, he worked with court eunuchs to arrest and eliminate the Du brothers. This was successful. The Dao family fell from power. But this created a new problem. Emperor He, grateful to the eunuchs who had helped him, gave them increasing power and privileges. Eunuchs were castrated men who served in the inner palace. Because they couldn't have children and thus couldn't establish their own dynasties, they were considered safe servants for the emperor. They had access to the emperor in his private quarters, unlike regular officials, and could develop close personal relationships with him. However, eunuchs using their proximity to the emperor to gain political power was a recurring problem in Chinese history, and it would become a major issue in the Eastern Han Dynasty. Emperor He's reign also saw the first of several conflicts between eunuchs and Confucian scholar officials, two groups that competed for influence over the emperor. The scholar officials despised the eunuchs, seeing them as uneducated, corrupt, and unworthy of power. The eunuchs, for their part, resented the scholar officials' disdain and worked to undermine them. During Emperor He's reign, military successes continued. The general Ban Chao, who we mentioned earlier, finally returned to China in 102 of the Common Era after spending 31 years in Central Asia. His campaigns had been successful, and the Silk Road remained under Han control. But the costs of maintaining this control were significant, and later emperors would struggle with whether the expense was worth it. Emperor He died in 105 of the Common Era. He was succeeded by his infant son, who became Emperor Xiang, but the baby died after only 8 months. Then another infant, Liu Hu, became Emperor An. He was only 13 months old when he took the throne. With an infant emperor, regency was inevitable. Empress Dowager Deng, the widow of Emperor He and adoptive mother of Emperor An, became regent. She was capable and conscientious, working to maintain good government during her regency, which lasted from 106 until her death in 121 of the Common Era. After Empress Dowager Deng died, Emperor An, now in his late teens, ruled in his own right, but he proved to be a weak emperor. He allowed eunuchs to gain even more power, and corruption increased at court. The central government's authority began to weaken. Emperor An died in 125 of the Common Era, and a familiar pattern repeated: infant emperors, regencies by empress dowagers, power struggles between consort families and eunuchs, and weak government. I won't detail every emperor from this point forward, as the pattern becomes repetitive and the individual reigns less distinctive, but let me outline the general trends that led to the fall of the Eastern Han Dynasty. From the early 2nd century of the Common Era onward, several interconnected problems plagued the dynasty. First, the succession problem. Many emperors died young or had no adult heirs, leading to child emperors. This meant power fell to regents, empress dowagers, and the families they came from. These families, the Du, the Deng, the Liang again, and others, would dominate politics during their regencies, promoting their own members and enriching themselves. Second, the eunuch problem. Emperors raised in the inner palace often developed close relationships with eunuchs who had cared for them since childhood. When these emperors reached adulthood and wanted to assert their authority, they sometimes turned to eunuchs to help them eliminate or reduce the power of their consort families. But this just transferred power from one group to another, and eunuchs proved to be just as prone to corruption and factionalism as anyone else. Third, the conflict between eunuchs and scholar officials. The Confucian scholars who staffed the bureaucracy despised the eunuchs and their influence. This led to intense factional conflict at court. There were purges and counter-purges, with eunuchs using their access to the emperor to eliminate scholar officials who opposed them, and scholars trying to convince emperors to reduce eunuch power. Fourth, the concentration of land. Despite occasional attempts at reform, land continued to concentrate in the hands of wealthy families. These families built large estates worked by tenant farmers or slaves. They often managed to avoid paying their full share of taxes through connections and corruption. This meant the tax burden fell increasingly on small farmers, who struggled and sometimes lost their land, joining the ranks of tenants or landless labourers. Fifth, natural disasters. The Yellow River flooded repeatedly during the Eastern Han period. There were droughts, locust plagues, earthquakes, and other disasters. These were interpreted as signs that the dynasty had lost heaven's favour, and they caused real suffering that drove people to desperation. Sixth, frontier problems. Maintaining control over the expanded empire was expensive. The Xiongnu remained a threat in the north. There were rebellions in the south and west. The costs of military campaigns and garrisoning distant regions strained the treasury. Seventh, corruption and inefficiency in the bureaucracy. As central authority weakened, local officials became more corrupt and unaccountable. They enriched themselves while neglecting their duties. The common people suffered under their exactions. All of these problems fed into each other. Land concentration increased inequality, which made people more vulnerable to natural disasters, which increased suffering, which the government failed to address because it was consumed by factional conflicts and weakened by corruption, which further reduced its legitimacy and effectiveness, which led to more problems. By the middle of the 2nd century, the situation was becoming critical. In 166 of the Common Era, there was a major factional purge. A group of eunuchs arranged for the arrest of over 200 scholar officials who had been criticizing eunuch power. Many were executed or imprisoned, and many more were banned from office. This became known as the First Partisan Proscription. The purges continued in 169 of the Common Era with the Second Partisan Proscription. The power of the eunuchs seemed unassailable. The scholar official class was demoralized and fragmented. The emperor, Emperor Ling, who ruled from 168 to 189 of the Common Era, was weak and allowed the eunuchs to dominate. Emperor Ling is also remembered for his eccentricities and misgovernment. He played at being a merchant in a mock marketplace built in the palace. He sold official positions to the highest bidder, with the eunuchs managing these sales and taking bribes. The administration of the empire became increasingly dysfunctional. Meanwhile, in the countryside, secret societies were forming. People who had lost hope in the government turned to religious movements that promised salvation and a better world. One of these movements was led by Zhang Zhu, who preached a form of Taoism and faith healing. His movement was called the Way of Supreme Peace, and its followers were known as the Yellow Turbans because they wore yellow headbands. Zhang Zhu and his brothers, Zhang Bao and Zhang Liang, claimed to have healing powers. They organized their followers into a hierarchical structure with 36 districts, each led by a commander. They preached that the current age was corrupt and that a new age of peace and equality was coming. Their message resonated with people who were suffering under corrupt officials, heavy taxes, and the effects of natural disasters. The movement grew rapidly. Within a few years, it had hundreds of thousands of followers across northern and central China. Zhang Zhuo carefully organized this mass movement, preparing for a coordinated uprising. He set a date in the second month of 184 of the Common Era for the rebellion to begin simultaneously across all the districts. However, one of his followers betrayed the plot to the government. The authorities learned of the planned uprising and began arresting Yellow Turban leaders in the capital. Zhang Zhu, realizing the plot had been discovered, had no choice but to launch the rebellion immediately, even though some districts weren't fully prepared. Zhang Zhu declared that the blue heaven of the Han Dynasty would fall and be replaced by a yellow heaven of a new age. The color yellow was associated with Earth in Chinese cosmology and represented the center and a new beginning. The rebels wrote the characters for first year of the Jiazi cycle on city walls, symbolizing the start of a new era. In 184 of the Common Era, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted. This was not a small uprising. It was a massive revolt that spread across much of northern and central China. Hundreds of thousands of people joined the rebellion. In some areas, entire commanderies fell under rebel control. They attacked government offices, killed officials who had oppressed them, opened prisons, burned tax records, and seized cities. The Han government was caught completely off guard. The rebels weren't just destructive, they tried to implement their vision of a just society in the areas they controlled. They distributed food from government granaries to the hungry. They organized communal living based on their religious principles. But they also struggled with discipline and organization as their numbers swelled with desperate people who joined more out of hunger than conviction. The court was panicked. Emperor Ling, who had been focused on his pleasures and selling offices, suddenly faced an existential threat. He appointed He Jin, a general, to coordinate the government's military response. The court sent out calls for military assistance, and various generals and regional leaders responded. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, and Zhang Zhuo died during the conflict. But it took considerable effort and revealed how weak the central government had become. The court had to rely on regional military commanders, giving them armies and authority. These commanders would become powerful warlords. Even after the main Yellow Turban Rebellion was put down, other rebellions continued to flare up. The empire was increasingly unstable. Emperor Ling died in 189 of the Common Era, and his death triggered a final crisis. There was a succession dispute between two factions at court, one supporting Emperor Ling's eldest son Liu Bang, and another supporting his younger son Liu Xie. The faction supporting Liu Bang included the eunuchs. The faction supporting Liu Xie was led by He Jin, the brother of one of Emperor Ling's consorts. Liu Bian was enthroned as Emperor Shao, but Jin plotted to eliminate the eunuchs. He called a warlord named Dong Zhuo to bring his army to the capital to intimidate the eunuchs. But before Dong Zhuo arrived, the eunuchs learned of the plot and assassinated Jin in 189 of the Common Era. Jin's followers then launched a massacre of the eunuchs. They hunted them down throughout the palace, killing hundreds. In the chaos, some eunuchs tried to escape with the young emperor and his brother. They fled the palace, but were pursued and killed. The two imperial princes were rescued by Dong Zhuo's forces, who had just arrived. Dong Zhuo now found himself in control of the capital and the emperor. He was a brutal warlord from the northwest frontier, more interested in power than in propriety. He deposed Emperor Shao after only 5 months and installed Liu Xie as Emperor Xiang in 189 of the Common Era. Emperor Xiang would be the last emperor of the Han Dynasty, ruling in name until 220 of the Common Era, though he had little real power for most of that time. Dong Zhuo ruled as a tyrant. He terrorized the court, killed or drove away officials who opposed him, and looted the capital. His behavior was so outrageous that it provoked a coalition of regional warlords to rise against him in 190 of the Common Era. Various governors and generals, each with their own armies, declared themselves opposed to Dong Zhuo and marched toward the capital. Dong Zhuo, realizing he couldn't hold the capital against this coalition, made a shocking decision. In 190 of the Common Era, he forced Emperor Xiang and the court to relocate to Chang'an, the old Western Han capital, and then he burned Luoyang to the ground. The great capital of the Eastern Han Dynasty was destroyed, its palaces and buildings reduced to rubble. The warlord coalition fought some battles against Dong Zhuo's forces, but didn't achieve decisive victory. More importantly, the warlords couldn't agree among themselves. They had united against Dong Zhuo, but they all had their own ambitions. The coalition fell apart, and the warlords turned on each other. Dong Zhuo continued to rule from Chang'an, but in 192 of the Common Era, he was assassinated by his own adopted son, Liu Bang, in a plot orchestrated by Wang, a court official. However, this didn't restore order. Dong Zhuo's officers seized power, killed Wang, and continued to hold Emperor Xiang hostage. Meanwhile, across China, warlords fought each other for territory and supremacy. China descended into a period of chaos and warfare that would last for decades. This period is known as the late Eastern Han Dynasty and the transition to the Three Kingdoms period. The collapse of central authority created a power vacuum that ambitious military leaders rushed to fill. Some of these men were former government officials who had been given military commands to fight the Yellow Turbans and then refused to give up their armies. Others were local strongmen who had organized militias to defend their regions and then expanded their power. Still, others were opportunists who saw a chance to carve out their own domains. Among the many warlords, a few emerged as particularly powerful. In the north, Yuan Shao controlled much of Hebei. He came from a prestigious family that had produced several generations of high officials, and he used his family's reputation and connections to gather support. He was joined by his brother Yuan Shu, though the two brothers would later become rivals. In the east, Yuan Shu himself established an independent base of power. He was arrogant and ambitious, and in 197 of the Common Era, he did something shocking. He declared himself emperor. This was a step too far for most of the other warlords, who still at least nominally acknowledged the Han Dynasty. Yuan Shu's imperial pretensions alienated potential allies and contributed to his eventual defeat. In the west, Ma Teng controlled parts of the northwest frontier. He was of mixed Chinese and Qiang heritage and had influence among both groups. Meanwhile, in the far west, various smaller warlords struggled for control of the strategic regions along the Silk Road. In the central plains, numerous smaller warlords fought each other. Some controlled only a single city or commandery. The countryside was devastated by these constant wars. Armies pillaged as they marched, taking food and supplies from farmers. Bandits took advantage of the chaos. Many people abandoned their farms and became refugees, wandering in search of safety and food. In the north, Cao Cao, a talented general and administrator, gradually built up his power. Cao Cao came from a family of modest origins. His grandfather had been a eunuch, which was considered a low status, but had accumulated wealth. Cao Cao himself received a good education and began his career as an official before the chaos began. When the empire fell into disorder, Cao Cao raised his own army. He was an unconventional leader in many ways. He valued merit over background, promoting talented men even if they came from humble families or had questionable pasts. He was also personally charismatic and could inspire fierce loyalty in his followers. In the south, Sun Jian and later his sons Sun Ce and Sun Quan established control over the Yangtze River region. Sun Jian was a professional soldier who had distinguished himself fighting the Yellow Turbans. He was killed in 191 or 192 of the Common Era while fighting against the warlord Liu Biao. His teenage son, Sun Ce, then took over his followers and, through a combination of military brilliance and political skill, conquered much of the southeastern region. Sun Ce was known as Little Conqueror because of his military prowess at such a young age, but he was assassinated in 200 of the Common Era by retainers of a man he had killed. His younger brother, Sun Quan, then inherited leadership at the age of 18. Sun Quan would prove to be a capable and long-lived leader, ruling his domain for over 50 years. In the west, Luoyang ruled Sichuan, having inherited the region from his father Luoyang, but he was a weak ruler and his control over Sichuan was tenuous. This wealthy and defensible region would become a prize that other warlords coveted. And then there was Liu Bei. Liu Bei was poor and of obscure origin, but he claimed descent from a Han prince and thus connection to the imperial family. Whether this claim was entirely legitimate is debatable, but it gave him a powerful rhetorical position. He could present himself as a loyal servant of the Han Dynasty, trying to restore order and eliminate traitors. Liu Bei had participated in fighting the Yellow Turbans, and then had a career of ups and downs, serving various warlords, and sometimes being driven out when they turned against him or were defeated. He gathered around himself talented men, most famously the warrior Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, and the strategic genius Zhuge Liang, who would become his chief advisor. The relationships between these warlords were complex and constantly shifting. Alliances were formed and broken. Former allies became enemies. Enemies sometimes became temporary allies against common threats. Marriage alliances were arranged and then became meaningless when political situations changed. In 196 of the Common Era, Cao Cao managed to rescue Emperor Xiang from Chang'an, which was itself in chaos after Dong Zhuo's former officers fought each other. Cao Cao brought the emperor to his base of power and established a new capital at Shu in 196 of the Common Era. From this point on, Cao Cao ruled in the emperor's name, though he never took the title of emperor for himself. Cao Cao was a complex figure. He was a brilliant military strategist, an able administrator, and a talented poet. He genuinely seemed to want to restore order to China, though, of course, he also wanted power for himself. He claimed to be a loyal servant of the Han Dynasty, using the emperor's authority to legitimize his actions. Under Cao Cao's rule, his territories saw a degree of recovery. He implemented land reclamation projects, reformed the military, promoted capable officials regardless of their background, and brought some stability. But he also faced constant warfare against rival warlords. One of Cao Cao's major rivals was Yuan Shao, another powerful warlord who controlled much of northern China. In 200 of the Common Era, Cao Cao and Yuan Shao fought the decisive Battle of Guandu. Yuan Shao had a much larger army, but Cao Cao used superior strategy. He feigned weakness, then launched a surprise attack on Yuan Shao's supply depot, burning his supplies. Yuan Shao's army collapsed, and Cao Cao won a great victory. This battle shifted the balance of power in northern China in Cao Cao's favor. Over the next few years, Cao Cao consolidated control over the north, defeating Yuan Shao's sons and other rivals. In the south, the situation was different. Sun Quan had established a strong kingdom in the Yangtze River region, with his capital at Jianye, modern-day Nanjing. His state was wealthy, benefiting from trade and agriculture in the fertile southern lands. In 208 of the Common Era, Cao Cao, having secured the north, turned his attention south. He led a large army down the Yangtze River, intending to conquer Sun Quan's territories. Sun Quan formed an alliance with Liu Bang, another warlord who claimed to be a distant relative of the Han imperial family and who positioned himself as a defender of the Han Dynasty. The two sides met at the Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 or 209 of the Common Era. The sources give different dates. Cao Cao's forces were large, but included many soldiers from the north who were not accustomed to naval warfare. Sun Quan's forces were skilled in river and naval combat. Using fire ships, Sun Quan's commanders Zhou Yu and Huang Gai created chaos in Cao Cao's fleet. Cao Cao's forces were defeated and he had to retreat north. The Battle of Red Cliffs was a turning point. It ended Cao Cao's hopes of quickly reunifying China under his control. Instead, China became divided into three major power centers: Cao Cao in the north, Sun Quan in the southeast, and Liu Bang, who after the battle was able to establish himself in the west, eventually taking control of Sichuan. This division would give its name to the next period of Chinese history, the Three Kingdoms, but technically the Han Dynasty hadn't ended yet. Emperor Xiang still nominally ruled, though he was completely under Cao Cao's control. Cao Cao died in 220 of the Common Era, having never taken the imperial title for himself. He was succeeded by his son Cao Pai, and Cao Pai was less patient than his father. Later, in 220 of the Common Era, he forced Emperor Xiang to abdicate in his favor. The Han Dynasty officially ended. Cao Pi proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Cao Wei, or just Wei. The Han Dynasty, which had begun with Emperor Gaozu in 202 before the Common Era and been restored by Emperor Guangwu in 25 of the Common Era, was finally over. It had lasted, with the interruption of Wang Mang's Xin Dynasty, for over 400 years. But interestingly, the other two kingdoms didn't accept this. Liu Bei, who claimed Han descent, declared himself emperor of the Han Dynasty in 221 of the Common Era, claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the dynasty. His state is known as Chu-Han, or just Shu, and Sun Quan eventually proclaimed himself emperor of the Wu Dynasty in 229 of the Common Era. So technically, depending on how you view it, the Han Dynasty either ended in 220 when Emperor Xiang abdicated, or in 263 when the Shu Han state was conquered by Wei, or even 280 when all three kingdoms were finally reunified by the Jin dynasty. But in the conventional historical narrative, 220 marks the end of the Han dynasty and the beginning of the Three Kingdoms period. Emperor Xian, the last emperor, lived on after his abdication. Cao Pi treated him relatively well, giving him a noble title and a small fief. He died in 234 of the Common Era, 14 years after the end of the dynasty. So, what was the legacy of the Han Dynasty? Why does it matter more than 2,000 years later? The Han Dynasty was foundational to Chinese civilization. Even today, the majority ethnic group in China calls themselves the Han people, Han Zu. The Chinese writing system, which was standardized under the Qin but refined and spread under the Han, remained essentially the same for 2,000 years. The Confucian bureaucratic system established under Emperor Wu became the model for Chinese government for millennia. The Han Dynasty also established China as a major power. The Silk Road connected China to Central Asia and beyond, spreading Chinese goods, technologies, and ideas across Eurasia. At the same time, Buddhism came to China, beginning a long process of cultural exchange and transformation. The Han Dynasty saw remarkable achievements in technology, science, and culture. Paper was invented during the Han Dynasty, traditionally attributed to Kai Lun in 105 of the Common Era, though paper-like materials may have existed earlier. This invention would eventually revolutionize communication and learning around the world. The development of paper was a gradual process. Earlier writing materials in China included bamboo strips, wooden tablets, and silk. Bamboo and wood were heavy and bulky, while silk was expensive. There was a need for something lighter and cheaper. Early forms of paper were made from hemp fibers, tree bark, and old rags, beaten into pulp and then spread thin to dry. Kai Lun, a court eunuch and official, is credited with improving the paper-making process and reporting it to the emperor, which led to its widespread adoption. The impact of this invention cannot be overstated. Paper made books cheaper and more portable. It facilitated the spread of education and literacy. Government administration became more efficient as documents could be produced and stored more easily. Although it would take centuries for paper to spread from China to the rest of the world, eventually through the Silk Road to the Islamic world and then to Europe, it would become one of China's most important technological contributions to human civilization. Han astronomers made detailed observations of the stars, planets, and comets. They recorded sunspots and supernovae. They created star catalogues, and celestial maps. They understood that lunar eclipses were caused by the Earth's shadow and could predict them with reasonable accuracy. They tracked the movements of planets and tried to understand their patterns. Jiang Heng, who lived during the Eastern Han period, invented the seismoscope, a device for detecting earthquakes in 132 of the Common Era. This remarkable instrument consisted of a bronze vessel with 8 dragon heads arranged around the outside, each holding a bronze ball in its mouth. Below each dragon was a bronze toad with its mouth open. When an earthquake occurred, a pendulum mechanism inside would trigger one of the dragons to release its ball, which would fall into the toad's mouth, indicating the direction of the earthquake. While this device couldn't predict earthquakes, it could detect them even when they were too far away to be felt locally, allowing the government to send aid to affected regions more quickly. Jiang Heng was also a mathematician, poet, and inventor of other instruments. He created an improved armillary sphere for astronomical observations and calculated pi to a reasonable approximation. In medicine, Han Dynasty physicians made significant advances. They developed theories about the body's qi, or vital energy, and how its flow affected health. They practiced acupuncture and moxibustion. They compiled pharmacological texts describing hundreds of medicinal substances. The Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, a foundational text of traditional Chinese medicine, was compiled during this period, though it claimed to record much older knowledge. In literature, the Han Dynasty produced the great historian Sima Qian, whose Records of the Grand Historian set the standard for historical writing in China. Sima Qian lived from around 145 to 86 before the Common Era, during the reign of Emperor Wu. He inherited the position of Grand Historian from his father and took on the monumental task of writing a comprehensive history of China from the legendary Yellow Emperor to his own time. His work faced a tragic interruption. Sima Qian defended a general who had been accused of cowardice, which angered Emperor Wu. As punishment, he was sentenced to death, but he chose castration instead so that he could live to complete his historical work. This was an agonizing choice, as castration was considered deeply humiliating, but Sima Qian felt his historical mission was more important than his personal dignity. The Records of the Grand Historian is not just a chronological list of events. Sima Qian created a format with different types of chapters, basic annals that recorded the deeds of rulers, chronological tables, treatises on topics like ritual and economics, hereditary houses of noble families, and biographies of notable individuals. This format influenced Chinese historical writing for 2,000 years. Sima Qian also had a sophisticated historical philosophy. He tried to be objective and fair, even toward people he personally disliked. He included stories that showed the faults of rulers as well as their virtues. He wrote about common people and rebels, as well as emperors and officials. He believed that history had moral lessons to teach, but he presented events and let readers draw their own conclusions rather than constantly moralizing. The era also saw the development of Yu Fu poetry, folk songs collected and preserved by the government's music bureau. These poems gave voice to the experiences of common people, soldiers on distant frontiers longing for home, farmers working in the fields, women waiting for absent husbands, and young people in love. They provide a window into the emotions and daily lives of ordinary people in the Han Dynasty. One famous Yu Fu poem, Southeast the Peacock Flies, tells the tragic story of a couple forced to separate because of family pressure, ending in their suicide. Another, The Orphan, describes the hard life of a child orphaned and mistreated by relatives. These poems show that despite the dynasty's achievements in government and culture, many people faced hardship, injustice, and sorrow. In philosophy, the synthesis of Confucianism with elements of other schools created what we might call Han Confucianism, which was the dominant ideology for centuries. Confucian scholars debated the interpretation of the classics. They wrote commentaries explaining the meanings of ancient texts. They argued about proper ritual, about ethics, about the best way to govern. There were also heated debates between different schools of Confucian thought. The Old Text school claimed to preserve ancient versions of the classics that had survived the Qin dynasty's book burning. The New Text school worked with versions that had been reconstructed from memory after the book burning. These two schools had different interpretations of some passages and different emphases in their teachings. In art, the Han Dynasty left us beautiful artifacts, jade burial suits, elaborate tomb murals, ceramic figurines, and bronze mirrors decorated with intricate patterns. The wealthy were buried in tombs filled with grave goods, meant to provide for them in the afterlife. These tombs often included ceramic models of houses, farms, servants, and animals, giving us detailed information about daily life and architecture. Jade burial suits are particularly remarkable. These were made by sewing together small jade plaques with gold, silver, or bronze wire to create a full-body suit for the deceased. The belief was that jade could preserve the body. Some of these suits contained over 2,000 individual jade pieces and represented an enormous investment of labour and materials. The two murals show scenes from daily life, mythology, and the spiritual world. We see banquets, hunting scenes, farming activities, and officials at work. We see mythological creatures and celestial journeys. These images provide invaluable evidence about how Han people lived, what they wore, what their buildings looked like, and what they believed about the afterlife. Daily life for most people in the Han Dynasty was centered around agriculture. The vast majority of the population were farmers who worked small plots of land, growing millet, wheat, rice, and vegetables. They lived in simple houses made of rammed earth or wood. They wore clothes made of hemp or, if they were wealthier, silk. They paid taxes in grain and labour, providing a certain number of days of work for the government each year. Families were patriarchal, with the oldest male having authority over the household. Filial piety, respect and obedience to parents was considered the most important virtue. Children were expected to care for their aging parents. Marriages were arranged by families, with the primary purpose being to produce male heirs to continue the family line and ancestral worship. Women's lives were restricted compared to men's. They were expected to be obedient to their fathers before marriage, to their husbands after marriage, and to their sons in widowhood. However, some women from powerful families could exercise considerable influence, as we've seen with the Empress Dowagers who served as regents. And in daily life, peasant women worked alongside men in the fields and had practical responsibilities that gave them some agency. Cities were centers of commerce, administration, and culture. Markets bustled with merchants selling goods from across the empire and beyond. Artisans produced pottery, metalwork, textiles, and other goods. Officials administered law and collected taxes. Scholars studied and taught in schools. The wealthy lived in spacious compounds with courtyards and gardens, while the poor crowded into small rooms in the cramped quarters of the city. But the Han Dynasty's story is also a cautionary tale about the challenges of maintaining a large empire over long periods. The problems that brought down the Han, land concentration, court factionalism, succession crises, eunuch power, natural disasters, military expenses, bureaucratic corruption, these were challenges that would face many Chinese dynasties after the Han as well. The Han Dynasty showed both the possibilities and the limitations of centralized imperial government. At its best, under emperors like Gaozu, Wen, Jing, Xuan, Guangwu, Ming, and Jiang, the system could bring peace, prosperity, and good administration to hundreds of millions of people. At its worst, under weak emperors surrounded by corrupt advisors, the same system could bring suffering and chaos. The cycle of rise, flourishing, decline, and fall that the Han Dynasty went through would be repeated by later dynasties. Chinese historians developed theories about this dynastic cycle, trying to understand why dynasties rose and fell, how virtue and vice in leadership affected the fate of nations, and whether human wisdom could break the cycle, or whether it was an inevitable pattern. As we finish our journey through the Han Dynasty, from Liu Bang's victory over Xiang in 202 before the Common Era to Emperor Xian's abdication in 220 of the Common Era, we've covered 422 years of history. We've seen 13 emperors of the Western Han Dynasty, from Gaozu to Ping, the brief interruption of Wang Mang's Xin Dynasty, and 14 emperors of the Eastern Han Dynasty, from Guangwu to Xi'an. We've witnessed the consolidation of empire, the expansion into Central Asia, the establishment of Confucian bureaucracy, the opening of the Silk Road, the introduction of Buddhism to China, the achievements in technology and culture, the court intrigues and factional conflicts, the rebellions and civil wars, and finally, the slow decline into the chaos of the Three Kingdoms period. The Han Dynasty was a time of both great achievement and great struggle, of wise leadership and foolish mismanagement, of expansion and contraction, of unity and fragmentation. It was, in other words, deeply human. The story of people trying to build something lasting in an uncertain world. And now, as we conclude this episode of Sleepless History, perhaps you're ready for sleep, or perhaps you're wide awake, your mind full of emperors and generals, rebellions and reforms, dynasties rising and falling, like waves on the shore of time. Either way, thank you for joining me on this journey through the Han Dynasty. May your dreams, if you sleep, be filled with the silk roads and ancient palaces, the wisdom of scholars and the courage of soldiers, the vast sweep of history and the intimate moments of individual lives. And may you wake, when you do, with a deeper appreciation for the long, complex, fascinating story of human civilization, of which the Han Dynasty is just one chapter, but what a chapter it was. Good night or good day, wherever you are in time and space. This has been Sleepless History.